Tu Tien ate a slice of pickled mustard greens and her eyes lit up. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing that does not usually mean anything. She had been eating slowly for 10 minutes, small, careful bites of rice, avoiding the pork, and then she had reached for the pickled greens and put one piece in her mouth, and her whole face had changed. Across the table, Jack set down his chopsticks. He did it without thinking. The way a person sets something down when their hands have suddenly decided they need to be free for whatever might happen next. More, Tu Tien said, to no one in particular. Met, is there more of this? There is a whole jar in the kitchen, Mrs. Lurie said. She did not look up from her bowl. I'll bring it. I'll get it, Tu Tien said. She was already standing. She walked to the kitchen. Jack watched her go. He looked at his mother. His mother was eating rice with the exact composure of a woman who had already eaten this entire situation for breakfast and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Met, Jack said quietly. Eat your rice, Khan. Meh. Eat your rice. He picked up his chopsticks. He did not eat his rice. Bak Dung was the only one who had not noticed anything. He was in the middle of explaining how he intended to plant longan trees along the southern fence next spring, and which variety, and why the soil was wrong for citrus but perfect for longan, and Jack was nodding because Jack had been raised by a woman who had taught him that you nod while older men explain things to you, even when your entire body has gone very still about something else. Tu Tien came back from the kitchen with the jar of pickled greens. She sat down. She put 3 more pieces on her rice. She ate them carefully, with the focused attention of a person discovering that something she had eaten her entire life had suddenly become the most interesting thing on the table. Jack picked up his glass of water. He drank it slowly. Bak, he said, when there was a small pause. Yes. The longans when you plant them in spring. What month exactly? February. Early February. Before the dry wind starts. Good. Jack set his glass down. Tu Tien, would you like to step outside for some air? The kitchen is warm. She looked up. She looked at the jar of pickled greens. She looked at him. Yes, she said quietly. I would. Mrs. Lurie did not look up from her bowl. Bak Dung, who had registered none of this beyond the surface request, waved his hand. Go, go, take your time. The pork is keeping. I'll talk longan trees with your mother. Jack stood up. He walked around the table. He did not touch Tu Tien's elbow or her shoulder. He simply walked beside her, the way he always walked beside her, and they went out through the wooden door and onto the small porch of Bak Dung's new house. The afternoon air was cooler than the kitchen. The garden smelled of new herbs and turned earth, and somewhere, faintly, the frangipani tree at the eastern corner. Tu Tien sat down on the wooden step. She did not say anything for a moment. Jack, yes, you set down your chopsticks. I know, you knew before the pickles. I suspected before the pickles. I knew with the pickles. Tu Tien looked at her hands. I was going to tell you tonight, she said. After the meal, when we were alone, in the room they're giving us, I had planned the words. I had been planning them for 3 days. It's okay. It is not how I wanted to do it. Tu Tien. He sat down beside her on the step. He did not touch her, yet he had learned, in 7 years, that Tu Tien needed to be the one to close the last centimeter when something was this large. It does not matter how it happens, only that it happens. She was quiet for a moment. Do you remember the durian? She said. He almost laughed. He pressed his mouth together to stop it. I remember the durian. I thought it was the smell. I know. It was not the smell. I know. She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. Not from crying, from the particular brightness that arrives in a face when something internal has been carrying weight for weeks and has finally been allowed to set the weight down. Jack. Yes. I think we should be sure. The pharmacy was at the corner of the village road. Bak Dung had told them earlier, in passing, that there was one 5 minutes walk, owned by a woman his age, open until evening. They had walked in the easy quiet of two people who were no longer pretending not to know what they were walking toward. Tu Tien went in alone. Jack stood across the road in the shade of a small tamarind tree. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the road and tried to think about something else and could not think about anything else. 3 minutes. She came out with a small paper bag, the way Vietnamese pharmacies wrap everything plain brown paper, twisted at the top. She walked across the road. She did not show him the bag. She did not need to. Bak Dung has a back washroom, she said. Behind the kitchen. I saw it earlier. Yes. Can you wait outside the door? Yes. They went in through the back garden. They did not pass through the kitchen. Tu Tien went into the small washroom and closed the door. Jack stood in the corridor outside. He could hear water running. He could hear the small sounds of a paper bag being unwrapped. He could hear his own heart, which was doing something very specific that he had not asked it to do. He waited. 2 minutes passed, then 3, then the door opened. Tu Tien stood in the doorway. She was holding the test in her right hand, between her thumb and forefinger, the way you hold something that has just told you a thing you have been waiting your entire adult life to hear. 2 lines, both lines read. Jack looked at the test. He looked at her face. She had not yet decided what to do with her own face. It was in the middle of figuring out, half smile, half disbelief, eyes wet, the particular face of someone who has known a thing for 3 weeks and now has it confirmed in a way they cannot unsee. Jack did not say anything. He stepped forward and put his arms around her gently. The careful gentleness that was already learning to be careful about a body that now contained more than one person, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the corridor of Bak Dung's new house for a long minute without speaking. When she pulled back, her face was still wet, but the disbelief was gone. What was there now was something more settled, something that had decided, Jack. Yes, we have to tell them. I know. Med already knows. I know. Then we have to tell Bak Dung. Yes. They walked back through the garden together. They held hands, not tightly, just held them, the way you hold a hand when you are walking toward a moment together and want the other person to be sure you are still there. The conversation at the table had moved to fish ponds. Bak Dung was explaining the depth ratio for the kind of carp he wanted to raise. Mrs. Ly was nodding the way she nodded when Bak Dung explained things, patient, attentive, with the small, private smile of a woman who had decided 40 years ago that listening to this particular man explain things was something she was willing to do for the rest of her life. Jack and Tu Tien stood in the doorway. Mrs. Ly looked up first. She looked at their faces. She set down her chopsticks. An Dung, she said softly, stop talking about the fish for a moment. Bak Dung stopped mid-sentence. He looked at her. He looked at Jack and Tu Tien standing in the doorway. He looked back at Mrs. Ly. What is it? He said. Jack walked Tu Tien to the table. He pulled out her chair. He waited until she sat down. Then he stood behind her, both hands resting lightly on the back of her chair, the way you stand behind someone when you are presenting them, and also protecting them at the same time. Bak, Jack said. His voice came out steady. Met? We have something to tell you. Bak Dung's hand had gone still on his rice bowl. Tu Tien is pregnant. The room held very still for 1 second. Mrs. Ly closed her eyes. Just briefly, the way you close your eyes when something you have been holding in your chest for an entire afternoon has finally been allowed to land. When she opened them, they were wet, but her face was already smiling. Then Bak Dung's face did something Jack had never seen it do. It crumpled, not dramatically, not loudly. It just gave. The whole composure of the man, the 30 years of careful restraint, the building foreman patience, all of it briefly, completely, gave way. His eyes filled, his mouth pressed into a line that could not hold. He put one large hand over his face, and his shoulders moved once, and Mrs. Lowry, who had been waiting an entire afternoon for her own moment of breaking, turned and stared at him instead. She had not seen him cry in 35 years. She had not seen him cry since the day she got married, the day he had stood outside the church for an hour before going in. He took his hand away from his face. He did not bother to wipe his eyes. He looked at Tu Tien. He looked at Jack. "A baby," he said. His voice was thick. "In this house, in the spring." "In the spring, Bak," Jack said. Bak Dung nodded. He nodded again. He could not seem to stop nodding. "Children should be born in houses with good morning light," he said. To no one in particular. The same thing he had said at the table 2 hours ago, back when none of them had known he was saying it on purpose. Mrs. Lowry was looking at Bak Dung, not at Tu Tien, not at Jack, at Bak Dung. For a long moment she just looked at him, with 35 years of composure breaking very slowly across her face, not dramatic, not loud, the same way his had broken, the slow give of a structure that has held everything it could possibly hold and has decided that today, in this house, in front of this news, it does not need to hold anything anymore. She reached her hand across the table. She did not look at where she was reaching. She just put her hand, palm up, in the empty space between them. Bak Dung looked at the hand. He looked at her face. He put his hand in hers. He did it the way a man crosses a threshold he has been standing at for 35 years slowly, with the small disbelief of someone who cannot quite believe the door has been open this whole time. Their hands closed. Across the table, Tu Tien made a small sound, a wet half laugh, and pressed her hand briefly against her mouth. Jack put his other hand on her shoulder. Outside the east-facing window, the afternoon light was beginning to soften toward evening. The new frangipani tree at the eastern corner of the property held its small white flowers very still. Somewhere down the lane, a child was calling another child home for dinner. The new house held the four of them and the very small fifth inside its wooden walls, and the walls were holding back. Jack said quietly, "Yes. You should ask her now." Bak Dung looked at Jack. Then he looked at Mrs. Lowry. Their hands were still joined across the table. His face was still wet. His ears were the color they had been the day he watched her plant the first frangipani tree. "Lode," he said. "An Dung. Will you?" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Mrs. Lowry's hand tightened around his. "Yes," she said softly. "An Dung, yes."